Thrown out before winter, a widow built a sawdust cabin for $10. Gunnar Holmberg, who had survived 9 Minnesota winters, told her plainly, "You'll freeze out there, and those children will freeze with you." She had $10, 2 children, and needed shelter she could not build. On January 12th, 1888, the temperature dropped 40 degrees in 6 hours. But 3 months earlier, Clara Engstrom had never driven a nail into a wall frame in her life. The letter from the Morrison Lumber Company arrived on the 4th of October, 1887. Clara read it twice, standing in the doorway of the company cabin while her 2 children ate cold porridge at the table behind her. The language was polite, the meaning was not. Her husband Eric had been dead for 6 weeks. A white pine had kicked back during felling. The Sawyers called it a widowmaker, and now Clara understood why. The company had allowed her to remain in the cabin through September as a courtesy. That courtesy was ending. She had until the 15th of October to vacate. 11 days. Clara folded the letter and placed it in her apron pocket. Her daughter Alma, 7 years old, looked up from her bowl. Her son Peter, 4, kept eating. They didn't ask about the letter. They had learned not to ask about letters. She walked to the window and looked out at the mill yard. The massive circular saw screamed through another white pine log, sending a fountain of sawdust into the growing pile behind the building. That pile was taller than a man now and still growing. By the end of cutting season, it would be taller than the company office. The mill foreman had complained just last week that they were running out of places to dump the stuff. Clara had 11 days. She had $10.37. She had 2 children who had never known a winter without their father to cut the firewood, to seal the cabin against the drafts, to wake in the frozen darkness, and feed the stove before the water bucket crusted with ice. And somewhere out on the cutover land, 3 miles from town, she had a homestead claim that Eric had filed the previous spring. 160 acres of stumps and brush, with nothing on it but a canvas tent and a ring of stones where they had cooked meals during their visits to clear the land. The law said she could hold that claim. The Homestead Act of 1862, she had read the words herself at the land office, used the language he or she. A widow was head of household. A widow could prove up a claim the same as any man. The law said nothing about how a woman alone was supposed to build a cabin before the snow came. Gunnar Holmberg had survived 9 Minnesota winters. He wore that fact the way other men wore military service, not spoken of directly, but visible in everything he did. The set of his shoulders when he looked at the sky, the way he stacked firewood with the precision of a man who had once run out, the dismissive grunt he gave to anyone who hadn't yet proved they could last. Clara found him at the land office on the 6th of October. She had come to confirm her claim, to make sure Eric's death hadn't voided it somehow. Holmberg was there conducting his own business, and he overheard her conversation with the clerk. The clerk had to scratch out the word he on her paperwork and write she above it. His pen hesitated 3 times. Holmberg watched this process with his arms crossed. When Clara turned to leave, he blocked her path. Not aggressively, he simply didn't move, and the doorway wasn't wide enough for 2. "You're the Engstrom widow," he said. It wasn't a question. "I am." "You're filing on that quarter section out past the Lindgren place, the cutover land?" "My husband filed it. I'm continuing the claim." Holmberg studied her the way he might study a sick horse, calculating whether it was worth the feed to keep alive. "You have shelter out there?" "I'll build shelter." "With what?" "I have money." The lie came easier than she expected. "How much money?" Clara said nothing. Holmberg nodded slowly. "That's what I thought." He stepped aside to let her pass, then spoke to her back. "Listen to me, Mrs. Engstrom. I'm not trying to be cruel, But a woman alone cannot cut enough timber to build a cabin before the snow flies. And even if you could, you cannot cut the 8 cords of firewood you'll need to survive till April, while also building that cabin and minding those children. He paused. You'll freeze out there, and those children will freeze with you. Clara turned. Then what do you suggest I do? There's a widow in town Mrs. Patterson takes in boarders. Go there. Wait out the winter. Find a husband in the spring, a woman your age, with children, someone will have you. Then try the claim again with a man to do the work. And if I don't want a husband? Holmberg's expression didn't change. Then I'll see you in the churchyard come April, you and both those little ones. He walked past her and out into the October sunshine, and Clara stood in the land office doorway doing the arithmetic he had laid out. A cabin required logs, dozens of them, each weighing hundreds of pounds, requiring a team of men with cant hooks and rope to lift into place. The Engstrom cabin in the mill yard had taken 4 men 2 weeks to build, and they were men who did such work for a living. She had no men. She had no team. She had 11 days. No, 9 now, before the company turned her out. She had $10. The numbers didn't add up. They couldn't add up. Holmberg was right, and Clara knew it. But she walked back to the company cabin anyway, because there was nowhere else to walk. The sawdust pile had grown again. Clara noticed it on the morning of October 7th as she walked Peter to the privy. The pile now reached nearly to the eaves of the storage shed behind the mill. A wagon stood nearby, and 2 men were shoveling sawdust into it, but not to keep. They were hauling it to the riverbank to dump. Clara watched them work. The sawdust was golden in the morning light, a mix of fine powder and coarse shavings, and it smelled of pine pitch and fresh wood. "Ma," Peter said, "I have to go." She took him to the privy, but she kept watching the men with the sawdust, and she kept thinking. That afternoon, she walked to the ice house behind Magnuson's general store. The ice house was a simple structure, board walls, a plank roof, nothing fancy. Magnuson sold ice to the hotels and the butcher shop through the summer, blocks he cut from the lake each February and stored for months without melting. Clara had never thought about how ice could survive a Minnesota summer until now. She knocked on the ice house door, and when no one answered, she opened it. The cold hit her face like a January morning. Inside, blocks of ice still sat in their beds of sawdust, pale and sweating but solid. It was October. The ice had been in there since February. 8 months. Sawdust had kept ice frozen through 8 months of summer. Clara stepped inside and pressed her hand against the wall. The wall was thick, nearly a foot thick. She could see where the boards had been spaced apart, with a gap between them, and that gap was filled solid with packed sawdust. She stood in the ice house for a long time, touching the wall, feeling the cold that stayed cold because the sawdust trapped it in. Heat and cold were the same problem, weren't they? Keeping something in, keeping something out. If sawdust could keep ice from melting in July, sawdust could keep heat from escaping in January. Clara walked out of the ice house and straight to the sawmill. Lars Ekdahl had worked at the Morrison mill for 15 years. He was the foreman now, a squat man with sawdust permanently embedded in the creases of his neck. He listened to Clara's request with the expression of a man who had heard many strange requests and expected to hear many more. "You want the sawdust?" he repeated. "Yes." "All you can haul?" "Yes." "And the slabs?" "Whatever you can spare." Ekdahl looked at the pile behind the mill. The pile that caused him headaches. The pile that had to be burned or dumped or somehow gotten rid of before the snow came, because frozen sawdust was even harder to move than fresh sawdust. "Mrs. Engstrom," he said slowly, I will give you every scrap of sawdust and every slab of barkwood you can carry off this property. I'll loan you a wagon to do it if you'll promise to bring the wagon back. You'd be doing me a favor." Clara felt something shift in her chest. Not hope, not yet, but the space where hope might fit. "There's one more thing," she said. "I need to know how that ice house is built, the one at Magnuson's, the double walls." Ekdal's eyebrows rose. "You're not building an ice house." "No, I'm building something else." She explained her idea. Ekdal listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "It might work," he said finally. "The sawdust holds cold in. Don't see why it wouldn't hold heat in. But Mrs. Engstrom, that's not how cabins are built." "I know. People will say you're crazy." "People already say I'm crazy." Ekdal almost smiled. "You'll need lime. Sawdust rots if it gets damp, and mice love to nest in it. Mix the sawdust with lime, 1 part lime to 10 parts sawdust, and it'll last longer and the mice will leave it alone. I can sell you a bag cheap." "How cheap?" 50 cents. Clara nodded. 50 cents left her $9.87. Still not enough, but closer. "One more thing," Ekdal said. "Sawdust settles. Over time, it packs down and leaves a gap at the top. Build yourself a hatch in the attic so you can pour more in when that happens." Clara thanked him. She walked back to the company cabin, and for the first time since Eric's death, she felt something other than dread. She had a plan. It was an insane plan. It would require her to build something no one else had built, using materials no one else had used, in a time frame no one else would attempt. But it was a plan. Thomas Ridley owned 400 acres adjoining Clara's claim. He had been trying to buy Eric's quarter section since June, and Eric had refused him. Now Eric was dead, and Ridley saw an opportunity. He came to the company cabin on October 8th, the day Clara loaded her first wagon of sawdust. "I heard you're moving out to the claim," Ridley said, standing in her doorway with his hat in his hands. He was a large man, thick through the middle, with a beard that covered most of his face. "That's right." "Going to build a cabin?" "That's right." Ridley looked at the wagon, at the golden heap of sawdust piled high in the bed. His expression shifted from polite interest to something harder to read. "What's that for?" "Insulation." "Insulation." Ridley repeated the word as if tasting it. "You're insulating a cabin with sawdust?" "The ice house uses sawdust, keeps ice frozen all summer." "An ice house isn't a home, Mrs. Engstrom." Clara lifted another shovelful of sawdust into the wagon. Her arms already ached. She had been shoveling for an hour. "I'm not asking for your opinion, Mr. Ridley. I'm offering to buy your claim." His voice hardened. "Fair price. You could board in town all winter, comfortable. Start fresh in the spring. My claim isn't for sale. You won't survive out there. A woman alone, 2 children, a shack stuffed with sawdust." Ridley shook his head. "When the first real cold comes, you'll burn that cabin down trying to keep warm, or you'll freeze in your beds. Either way, the claim opens up." Clara stopped shoveling. She turned to face Ridley, and something in her expression made him step back. "Mr. Ridley," she said, "if I freeze, you're welcome to the land. But if I don't freeze, I'd appreciate it if you'd never speak to me again." Ridley put his hat back on. "I'll see you in the spring, Mrs. Engstrom, one way or another." He walked away. Clara watched him go, then returned to shoveling. Her shoulders screamed. Her back was already stiffening. She had 3 more wagon loads to move today, and this was only the first. But she kept shoveling, because the only alternative was to prove Thomas Ridley right. By October 11th, Clara had moved to the homestead claim. She had no choice. The company needed the cabin, and she had run out of extensions to ask for. The tent was waiting where Eric had left it, staked in the clearing beside the stone fire ring. The canvas was weathered but sound. It would keep the rain off, but it would not keep the cold out. At night, the temperature was already dropping into the 30s. Clara woke twice each night to pull the children closer, to wrap the blankets tighter, to listen to the wind and wonder how much time she had left. The sawdust pile sat nearby. 8 wagon loads, nearly twice her height. The slab wood was stacked beside it, rough, bark-edged boards that the mill had no use for. Tar paper, a keg of nails, a small box stove that Clara had bought used from a widow in town for $2. 9 days. She had 9 weeks' worth of work to do in 9 days. Clara began on the morning of October 12th. The foundation was simple. 4 flat stones at the corners, leveled with her eye and a bucket of water. The floor frame was harder. The slabs were heavy, awkward, and she had never built a floor frame before. She worked from memory, from watching Eric, from a diagram she had sketched on brown paper after studying the ice house construction. By the end of the first day, she had the floor frame laid out. By the end of the second day, she had the floorboards nailed in place, rough, uneven, but solid. A floor, a real floor. Alma helped where she could, holding boards steady while Clara hammered. Peter gathered the smaller slabs and stacked them by size. They worked until the light failed, ate cold biscuits in the tent, and collapsed into sleep. On October 14th, Sven Lindgren rode over from his farm to see what Clara was doing. Lindgren was not like Holmberg or Ridley. He was a quiet man, thin and weathered, who had lost his own wife to consumption 3 years prior. He raised his children alone now, 4 of them, and he understood something about doing impossible work without help. He watched Clara struggle to raise the first outer wall frame, a grid of slabs nailed together, heavy and unwieldy. She had propped it against a sawhorse and was trying to lever it upright with a pole, but the angle was wrong and the frame kept slipping. Lindgren dismounted without a word, walked over, and took hold of the frame. Together they lifted it into place. Clara braced it with angled supports while Lindgren held it steady. "Thank you," she said. "I came to tell you something." Lindgren's voice was flat. "People in town are talking. They say you're building a chicken coop out here. They say you're filling the walls with sawdust." "That's right." "Sawdust settles, Mrs. Engstrom." "I know. I've built a hatch to add more. Mice nest in it. I've mixed it with lime." Lindgren studied the wall frame, the gap where the sawdust would go. His expression was unreadable. "I've seen ice houses," he said slowly. "Never thought about using the same idea for a house. It's the same principle, trapping air, slowing heat loss." "Maybe." He stepped back. "I hope you're right, Mrs. Engstrom, because if you're wrong, you and those children—" He stopped himself. "I hope you're right." He rode away without offering to help further. Clara understood. He had his own farm to prepare for winter, his own children to protect. He had given her what he could spare, 10 minutes and a raised wall frame. It was more than anyone else had given. The outer walls went up over the next 4 days. Clara worked 14 hours each day, stopping only when the light failed or when the children needed her. Her hands blistered, tore open, and blistered again. She wrapped them in strips of petticoat and kept working. Her back seized on the morning of October 16th, and she spent 20 minutes lying on the cold ground, staring at the sky, wondering if this was how it ended. It wasn't. She got up. She kept building. The inner walls were easier, lighter slabs, closer spacing. The gap between the inner and outer walls was 10 inches, measured with a stick Clara had notched for the purpose. 10 inches of dead air space, 10 inches of sawdust. On October 19th, she began filling the walls. The sawdust went in from above, poured from buckets through the open top of the wall cavity. Clara climbed a ladder and dumped bucket after bucket, while Alma tamped the sawdust down from below, pressing it firm with a flat board on a stick. The lime made them both cough. The sawdust clung to their skin, their hair, their clothes. By evening, they looked like they had been rolled in flour. Peter sat by the stone ring and watched. He was too young to help with this work. Clara hated leaving him idle, hated the fear in his eyes when he looked at the darkening sky. "Mama," he said that evening as they ate their supper in the half-finished cabin, "is the house going to be warm?" Clara looked at the walls, boarded on both sides now, packed solid with sawdust between. She touched the inner wall. Already she thought she could feel a difference. The wind was blowing outside, but the wall didn't radiate cold the way the canvas tent did. "Yes," she said, "the house is going to be warm." She hoped she wasn't lying. By October 25th, the walls were complete. The ceiling went up next, boards laid across joists, 8 inches of sawdust piled on top, covered with a final layer of slabs to keep the wind from scattering it. The roof was simple shed construction, sloped to shed snow, covered with tar paper nailed tight. Clara installed the box stove on October 27th. She positioned it in the corner farthest from the sawdust walls, with sheet metal scavenged from a rusted wash tub between the stove and the nearest wall. The stovepipe went straight up through the ceiling and roof, with a metal collar to protect the wood. That night, she lit the first fire. The stove took time to warm. Clara fed it small pieces of kindling, then larger slabs, building the heat gradually the way Eric had taught her. Alma and Peter sat on the floor near the stove, wrapped in blankets, watching the flames through the open door. An hour passed. Clara pressed her hand against the inner wall, 4 feet from the stove. Warm, not hot. The stove wasn't roaring yet, but warm. The wall felt warm. She moved along the wall, pressing her palm every few feet. Warm, warm, warm. Even the corner farthest from the stove, which should have been cold because the wind was blowing against that wall outside, felt warm. She pressed her hand against the outside wall near the door, where there was no sawdust, just single boards. Cold. Noticeably colder than the insulated walls. Clara looked at her children. Alma had fallen asleep against Peter's shoulder. Peter was staring at the fire, his eyes heavy. "It works," Clara whispered. She wasn't talking to them. She wasn't talking to anyone. But she needed to say it out loud. "It works." The first snow fell on November 3rd. 2 inches of powder that melted by afternoon. Clara was still cutting firewood. She had 3 cords stacked against the north wall of the cabin. Not enough, not nearly enough. Holmberg had said 8 cords minimum. Other settlers said 6 at least if you were careful and your cabin was tight. Clara was betting everything on 4. 4 cords, half what a normal cabin would need. If the sawdust insulation worked the way she believed, 4 cords would last the winter. If it didn't, 4 cords would run out sometime in February, and she and the children would burn the furniture, then the floorboards, then the walls themselves. She kept cutting. Her axe bit into frozen wood. Her breath hung white in the air. The blisters on her hands had hardened into calluses, and the calluses had cracked and bled and hardened again. On November 10th, Sven Lindgren stopped by again. He didn't dismount this time, just reined in his horse near the woodpile and looked at Clara's stacks. 3 cords, he said. A 3.5. Clara leaned on her axe. Nearly 4. That's not enough. It will be. Lindgren was quiet for a moment. The Ridley boy came by my place yesterday. Said you'd be begging for shelter by Christmas. Said your cabin's a fire trap stuffed with kindling. Clara felt the heat rise in her chest. Thomas Ridley's son doesn't know what he's talking about. Maybe not. Lindgren looked at the cabin, the rough slab walls, the tar-papered roof, the thin smoke rising from the stovepipe. But people are listening to him. They're saying you're reckless, saying you're putting those children in danger. What do you think? Lindgren took a long time to answer. I think you're either very smart or very stubborn. Maybe both. He nodded toward the wood pile. I've got some dead oak on my west fence line. It's in my way, and I don't have time to move it. If you want to haul it, you can keep whatever you cut. Clara's throat tightened. Charity. He was offering charity, dressed up as a trade. What do I owe you for it? Nothing. It's in my way. You'd be doing me a favor. She knew he was lying. She accepted anyway. By December 1st, Clara had 4.5 cords stacked. The cabin had been tested by nights in the single digits. Cold enough to freeze water buckets outside, but not cold enough to prove anything. The stove burned steadily. The walls stayed warm. The children slept through the night without waking to complain of cold. But winter hadn't truly arrived yet. December brought snow. Real snow. 17 inches in 3 days, with winds that piled drifts against the north wall higher than Peter could reach. Clara dug paths from the cabin to the woodpile, from the woodpile to the privy, from the privy back to the cabin. The paths filled in overnight. She dug them again. On December 15th, the temperature dropped to 12 below zero. Clara fed the stove through the night, rising every 2 hours to add wood. In the morning, she checked the walls. Warm. Still warm. The frost on the single window had formed on the glass, but not on the wall beside it. She counted the wood she had burned, half a cord in 2 weeks. That pace would exhaust her supply by early March. But other cabins were burning faster. Clara heard the stories when she walked to town for flour. The Anderson family had already gone through 2 cords. The new claim east of Lindgren's had abandoned their shanty and moved into town. 2 families were sharing a cabin because neither had cut enough wood alone. And it was only December. Clara walked back to her claim in the brittle silence of the frozen afternoon. The sun set before she reached the cabin, and the temperature was falling again. She could feel it, the air growing sharper, the cold pressing against her skin like something alive. Inside, the cabin was warm. The stove glowed red behind its iron door. Alma was reading to Peter from the only book they had, a battered Bible that had belonged to Eric's mother. The sawdust walls held the heat in. Clara looked at the calendar she had nailed to the wall. December 15th. 4 months until spring. 4 cords of wood. 4 months of winter. The numbers might work. The numbers might fail. And outside, the cold kept deepening. The storm came on December 23rd. Clara woke to the sound of wind. Not the normal wind that had blown all month, but something deeper, something that made the cabin walls groan. She got up in the darkness and fed the stove, checked the windows, checked the door. By morning, the world outside had disappeared. Snow drove sideways past the single window, so thick she couldn't see the woodpile 15 feet away. The wind shrieked like a living thing. Alma and Peter stayed close to the stove. Clara sat with them, listening to the storm batter the walls, waiting to feel the cold creep in. It didn't come. The walls creaked. The roof popped. A drift began forming against the door, blocking light from the cracks. But inside, the temperature barely dropped. Clara touched the walls again and again, expecting to feel the cold seeping through. The walls stayed warm. The storm lasted 3 days. On the morning of December 26th, Clara dug out the door and stepped into a transformed world. The snow was waist-deep in places, sculpted by wind into frozen waves. The woodpile was buried under a 4-foot drift, but the cabin was standing. The cabin was warm. Clara counted what remained in the woodpile. 3.5 cords, maybe a little less. January was coming, February, March. The numbers were going to be close. She started digging toward the firewood, her breath steaming in the Christmas cold. The sky was clear now, brilliant blue, and the temperature was 18 below zero. But inside the cabin, the sawdust walls held. And somewhere out on the prairie, the real test was still building. Chunk 2 continues. January came in hard and stayed hard. The first week brought temperatures that never rose above zero. Clara burned wood steadily, feeding the stove every 3 hours through the day and twice through the night. She tracked her consumption with marks on the wall, 1 mark for each armload of split oak. By January 7th, she had burned just over half a cord since the new year began. The math was holding, barely. On January 9th, Sven Lindgren rode over through the frozen afternoon. His horse's breath steamed in great clouds, and ice had formed in Lindgren's beard. He didn't dismount, just sat in the saddle and looked at Clara's cabin as if seeing it for the first time. "You're still here," he said. "I'm still here." "How much wood have you burned?" Clara told him. Lindgren's eyebrows rose. "That's half what I've burned. And my cabin's bigger, but not twice as big. The walls hold the heat in." Lindgren was quiet for a moment. Then he dismounted, walked to the cabin, and pressed his palm flat against the outer wall. Clara watched him move along the wall, pressing every few feet the way she had done that first night in October. "It's not cold," he said. "The wall's not cold. The sawdust traps the air. Dead air doesn't conduct heat. Same principle as the ice house, but reversed." Lindgren turned to look at her. His expression had changed. Something had shifted behind his eyes. "I've lived here 11 years, he said slowly. "Built 3 cabins. Never thought to try this." "Neither did I, until I had no choice." He nodded. He didn't apologize for doubting her. Men like Lindgren didn't apologize. But he touched his hat before he mounted, and that was acknowledgement enough. "Storm coming," he said as he turned his horse. "Day after tomorrow, maybe. The birds are acting strange." Clara looked at the sky. Clear blue, not a cloud visible. But Lindgren had survived 11 Minnesota winters. He knew things she didn't. "Thank you for the warning." He rode away. Clara went back inside, checked her wood supply, and began planning for another siege. The morning of January 12th dawned warmer than any day since November. Clara woke to silence. The wind that had howled for weeks had stopped. When she opened the cabin door, the air that touched her face was mild, impossibly mild. She could smell thawing snow. Somewhere in the distance, a bird was singing. Peter ran outside before she could stop him, laughing at the warmth, scooping up handfuls of softening snow. Alma followed, then stopped in the doorway to stare at the sky. "Mama," she said, "it's warm." It was warm. Clara stood in the doorway and felt the sun on her face and tried to remember the last time she had felt sun without also feeling the bite of wind. December? November? The warmth was disorienting, miraculous. By mid-morning, the temperature had risen to nearly 50 degrees. The icicles on the cabin eaves were dripping. The snow in the yard had turned to slush. Clara hung laundry on the line, sheets and shirts that had been waiting for weeks, and watched them steam in the sunshine. Around noon, she let the fire die down to coals. No sense burning wood when the cabin was holding heat on its own. The children played outside, building a snowman from the softening drifts, their laughter carrying across the clearing. Clara walked to the edge of the property and looked northwest, toward the direction storms usually came from. The sky was clear. The horizon was empty. Nothing but blue sky and bright sunshine and a warmth that felt like a gift. She should have known. Gifts on the frontier always came with a price. The wall appeared at 2:17 in the afternoon. Clara saw it first, a dark line on the northwest horizon, low and thick, like smoke from a distant fire. But it was moving, moving fast, moving faster than anything she had ever seen in the sky. She watched for perhaps 10 seconds, trying to understand what she was seeing. Then she understood, and the understanding hit her like a physical blow. "Alma! Peter! Inside! Now!" The children looked up from their snowman. Peter started to protest. "Now!" Something in her voice moved them. They ran. Clara grabbed the laundry from the line, half of it, as much as she could carry, and ran after them. The dark wall was growing, eating the sky, and the temperature was already dropping. She could feel it on her skin, the warmth bleeding away, the cold rushing in. She reached the door as the first gust hit. The wind came like a living thing. One moment the air was still, the next it was screaming. Clara threw herself inside, slammed the door, and dropped the bar into place. Through the single window, she watched the world disappear. Snow. Not falling snow. Horizontal snow, driving snow, snow that moved so fast it seemed solid. The sky vanished. The woodpile vanished. The privy 15 feet from the cabin vanished. Everything outside the window became a howling white void. The temperature inside the cabin dropped 10 degrees in the time it took Clara to reach the stove. She fed the coals, kindling first, then larger pieces, building the fire as fast as she dared without smothering it. The stove door glowed red. Heat poured into the room, but the cold was pouring in too, through the cracks around the door, through the gaps in the window frame, through every tiny imperfection in the structure. Number, not through the walls. Clara pressed her hand against the inner wall, and the wall was still warm. The sawdust was holding. The cold was coming through the gaps, not through the insulation. She grabbed rags, old clothes, anything she could find, and stuffed them into the cracks around the door. She hung a blanket over the window. She pulled the children close to the stove and wrapped them in quilts. The wind shrieked. The cabin shuddered. Somewhere outside, something tore loose and crashed. The privy door, maybe, or a section of fence. Peter started to cry. "It's all right," Clara said. "We're safe inside. The walls are holding." But the cold kept coming. By 4 o'clock, the temperature outside had dropped to 20 below zero. Clara knew this because the water bucket near the door, 10 feet from the stove, had frozen solid. The cabin's interior had stabilized at something close to 40 degrees near the stove, colder in the corners, cold enough to see their breath, not cold enough to kill. Not yet. Clara fed the stove steadily, one split log every 20 minutes. The woodpile inside the cabin, a half cord she had stacked against the far wall for exactly this kind of emergency, was shrinking visibly. She counted what remained. 18 hours worth, maybe 20 if she was careful. The storm showed no sign of stopping. Alma sat closest to the stove, her back against the warm brick of the chimney base. She was quiet. Too quiet. Clara touched her forehead. Hot. Burning hot, even as the cabin grew cold. "Alma, look at me." Alma's eyes were glassy. She was shivering, but not from the cold. Fever. Her daughter had a fever. Clara felt something inside her crack, a wall she had built to hold back the terror, crumbling. Not now. Not this. She could fight the cold. She could fight the storm. She could not fight sickness, not out here, not with the world outside trying to kill them all. "Mama?" Peter's voice was small. "Is Alma sick?" "She needs to rest. Help me move the bedding closer to the stove." They made a nest of blankets and quilts on the floor, as close to the stove as Clara dared. She laid Alma in the nest and covered her, then sat beside her and stroked her hair while the wind screamed and the temperature kept falling. The stove ate wood. The woodpile shrank. Alma burned with fever while the cabin fought to stay warm, and outside people were dying. Clara didn't know about the deaths until later. She learned the stories in the days and weeks that followed, the terrible arithmetic of that afternoon. The storm had come without warning. The Signal Corps, the government weather service, had predicted clear skies. Farmers had gone to town. Children had walked to school. Settlers had ventured out in the sudden warmth, fooled by the January thaw into believing the worst was over. Then the wall hit. Teacher Loie Royce, in a schoolhouse 90 yards from a farmhouse, tried to lead 3 students to safety. The distance was short enough to see on a clear day, a 1-minute walk. In the whiteout, they became lost. The 3 children died. Royce survived but lost both feet to frostbite. Teacher Minnie Freeman, her schoolhouse roof torn off by the wind, tied her students together with strips of her own petticoat and led them half a mile through the blinding snow to shelter. All 13 survived. Freeman became a national hero. Others were not so fortunate. A farmer named Johann Kaufmann froze standing upright, his hands locked around a barbed wire fence. He had been following the fence line home. He made it to within 200 yards of his cabin before his body failed. A family called the Westerheims ran out of fuel during the night. The father burned the furniture, then the floorboards, then the interior walls. By morning, only the shell of the cabin remained, and the family was huddled in one corner, barely alive. Women died sitting upright in their homes with their children gathered around them. Their fires had gone out when the last bits of wood, hay, and broken furniture had been exhausted. The children died in their mothers' arms. 235 people died across the plains that night. The true number may have been higher. Some bodies weren't found until spring. Inside Clara's cabin, the fire never went out. She fed it through the night, rising every hour to add wood. Her internal clock became tied to the stove. The rhythm of the fire was the rhythm of survival. She checked Alma's fever. She held Peter when he woke crying. She touched the walls again and again, reassuring herself that the sawdust was holding, that the cold wasn't breaking through. The walls stayed warm, not hot. The cabin was cold, cold enough that Clara could see her breath even near the stove, but warm compared to what should have been. The sawdust was working. Every hour that passed without the cabin temperature dropping further was proof. At 2 in the morning, the wind reached its peak. The cabin groaned. A gust hit so hard that Clara thought the roof would tear away, like Minnie Freeman's schoolhouse. She threw herself over the children and waited. The roof held. At 3, Alma's fever broke. Clara felt her daughter's forehead and found it merely warm instead of burning. Alma opened her eyes, confused, then closed them again and fell into real sleep, not the shallow unconsciousness of fever, but the deep rest of recovery. At 5 in the morning, the wind began to die. By 7, the storm had passed. Clara opened the cabin door onto a world remade in white. The snow was waist-deep in the clearing, sculpted by wind into frozen waves and drifts. The temperature was 47 degrees below zero. The air was so cold it hurt to breathe, so cold that the moisture in her lungs crystallized with each breath. But she was breathing. The children were breathing. The cabin was standing. She looked at the woodpile. 2 days' worth remained, maybe 3 if she was careful. She had made it through the night with fuel to spare. The neighbors began arriving on January 14th. First came Lindgren, on skis because his horse couldn't move through the drifts. He had come to check on Clara, he said, to make sure she was alive. His own cabin had nearly failed. The chinking between the logs had blown out on the north wall, and he had spent the night stuffing rags and old clothing into the gaps while his children shivered. "How did you fare?" he asked. Clara showed him. She showed him the walls, still warm to the touch 2 days after the storm. She showed him the woodpile, still adequate when her neighbors had burned everything they had. She showed him the temperature marks she had scratched on the wall, tracking how the cabin's interior had held steady through the worst of the night. Lindgren stood in the center of the cabin and turned slowly, looking at the walls, the ceiling, the packed sawdust visible through a gap she had left for exactly this purpose. "It's an ice house," he said softly. "Turned inside out. That's what I kept telling people." "You were right." He said it simply without elaboration. "I want to know how you built it, every detail. I'm going to rebuild my north wall this spring," Clara told him. She told him about the double walls, the 10-inch gap, the sawdust mixed with lime. She told him about the settling and the access hatch, about the tar paper and the placement of the stove. Lindgren listened and asked questions and took notes on a scrap of paper he pulled from his pocket. When he left, he shook her hand. Not her husband's hand, not her father's hand. Her hand. The hand of someone who had built something that worked. Gunnar Holmberg came on January 16th. He stood outside the cabin for a long time before knocking. Clara watched him through the window, the man who had told her she would freeze, that her children would freeze with her, standing in her yard like a petitioner waiting for an audience. She made him wait. Then she opened the door. "Mrs. Engstrom." Holmberg removed his hat. His beard had ice in it, and his cheeks were raw from cold. "I came to see if you needed anything." "I don't." "I heard your cabin held through the storm." "It did." Holmberg shifted his weight. He was a man unused to being wrong, and the wrongness sat on him like an ill-fitting coat. "The Westerheim family nearly died," he said. "The Andersons lost 2 outbuildings. Johansson's claim shanty collapsed entirely. They're living with the Petersons now, 6 families in 1 cabin." He paused. "Your cabin held?" "Yes." "With sawdust in the walls?" "Yes." Holmberg looked at the walls, at the structure he had dismissed as a chicken coop, a fire trap, a death sentence. Clara could see him doing the arithmetic, the same arithmetic she had done in October, but with different numbers now. "I told you that you would freeze," he said finally. "I told you those children would freeze with you." "I remember. I was wrong." The words hung in the cold air. Clara let them hang. She didn't need his apology. She had needed his help in October, and he had given her only doubt. But the winter had answered his doubt, and that was enough. "Do you want to come inside?" she asked. "It's warmer in here than it is out there." Holmberg hesitated. Then he stepped through the door and into the warmth of Clara's impossible cabin. Thomas Ridley never came to see the cabin. Clara heard from Lindgren that Ridley's claimed shanty, thin frame walls, no insulation, had been uninhabitable during the storm. Ridley and his family had crowded into their root cellar and waited out the night underground, burning fence posts for heat. He was still alive. His interest in Clara's quarter section, however, had faded. He stopped telling people she would be begging for shelter by Christmas. He stopped telling people her cabin was a fire trap. He simply stopped talking about her entirely. That was its own kind of victory. By the end of January, 3 families had asked Clara to teach them her building method. By the end of February, the number had grown to 7. Clara showed them all freely: the double walls, the sawdust fill, the lime mixture, the settling hatches. She drew diagrams on brown paper and gave them away. She walked newcomers through her cabin and answered every question. Lindgren rebuilt his north wall in March, as soon as the ground thawed enough to work. He reported back to Clara that the rebuilt section stayed warmer than the rest of the cabin, noticeably warmer, measurably warmer. He was planning to redo the entire structure when he could afford the materials. The Andersons, who had burned half their furniture during the storm, built a new grain shed with sawdust walls that spring. The shed held temperature so well that their seed corn didn't freeze the following winter. A man named Olson, 3 claims to the east, built a sawdust-insulated smokehouse that kept meat cool through July. He told Clara the idea had come from her, and she felt something she hadn't felt since Eric's death, pride in something she had made. Clara proved up her homestead claim in the spring of 1891. The land inspector who certified her claim was not the same man who had questioned her board and sawdust shack in 1887. This inspector walked through her cabin, still standing, still warm in winter, still holding heat the way Clara had designed it, and made notes on his forms without comment. She had met the requirements. She had lived on the land continuously for the required period. She had made improvements. The claim was hers. 160 acres, a cabin that worked, 2 children who had survived. Clara never remarried. She raised Alma and Peter on the homestead, working the land herself, cutting her own firewood, maintaining the sawdust walls that had saved their lives. She added a second room to the cabin in 1893 and a small barn in 1895, both built with the same double-wall construction. She died in 1917 at the age of 62. Her obituary in the Morrison County Record mentioned her husband's death in a logging accident and her years as a successful homesteader. It did not mention sawdust. It did not mention the blizzard of 1888. Some things are too ordinary to survive in memory. A woman building a cabin, a wall filled with mill waste, a winter that came and passed like all the winters before. But Alma remembered. 70 years later, in 1958, Alma Engstrom Peterson told a visiting historian about her mother's cabin. She described the double walls, the packed sawdust, the warmth that held through the worst storm of the century. She described the night the temperature dropped 40 degrees in 6 hours, and the morning after, when her mother opened the door onto a frozen world and the cabin was still standing. The historian wrote it down. One paragraph in a book about frontier building methods published by the Minnesota Historical Society. A footnote to a footnote, but it was written down. On January 12, 1888, the temperature dropped more than 40 degrees in a single afternoon. The wind reached 60 miles per hour. 235 people froze to death across the northern plains. Gunnar Holmberg, who had survived 9 Minnesota winters, had told Clara Engstrom plainly, "You'll freeze out there, and those children will freeze with you." Clara had $10. She had 2 children. She had never driven a nail into a wall frame in her life. She built a cabin from sawdust and scrap wood and stubbornness. She built it in 8 weeks with her own hands. She filled the walls with waste from the mill, waste that other people burned or dumped in the river, and she bet her children's lives that dead air would hold heat the same way it held cold. On the morning of January 13th, 1888, Clara Engstrom opened her cabin door. The temperature was 47 below zero. The children were asleep by the stove. The fire was still burning.